The screams tore through the Castiglione estate at exactly 3 a.m., chilling the blood of New York's most ruthless crime syndicate boss. Arthur expected to find a nightmare. Instead, he kicked open the nursery door and found his mousy, quiet Nanny doing the unthinkable. Nothing would ever be the same. Arthur Castiglione was a man who traded in fear. As the head of the Castiglione crime family, his name was a whispered curse in the backrooms of New York, and a terrifying reality in the boardroom of his legitimate front companies. He was a man who had ordered the dismantling of rival empires over morning espresso, but standing in his sprawling, high-security compound on the North Shore of Long Island, staring at the baby monitor on his mahogany desk, Arthur was entirely powerless. It had been 8 months since his wife, Isabella, was caught in the crossfire of a Russian hit meant for him. Isabella's death had fractured Arthur's soul, turning him from a calculating businessman into a ruthless, vengeance-driven ghost. But the collateral damage of that night extended far beyond his own grief. His 5-year-old twins, Leo and Lily, had been in the back seat of the SUV when it happened. They had survived without a scratch. Physically, psychologically, they were shattered. The night terrors started a week after the funeral. They were violent, inconsolable episodes that left the children exhausted and Arthur feeling utterly incompetent. He had hired the best child psychologists in the state, flown in specialists from Geneva, and run through a staggering 7 nannies in 3 months. Some quit because they couldn't handle the screaming. Others were fired because Arthur saw them looking at his children with pity. He didn't want pity for his bloodline. He wanted resilience. Then came Hannah Reid. Hannah was recommended by an exclusive, deeply private agency in London that catered to ultra-high net worth individuals who required absolute discretion. When she walked into Arthur's study for her interview 2 weeks ago, Arthur had barely looked up from his ledger. She was relentlessly unremarkable. She wore a modest gray cardigan, a plain white blouse, and thick-rimmed tortoiseshell glasses that obscured her pale green eyes. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe, utilitarian bun. She didn't flinch at his cold demeanor, nor did she ask questions about the armed guards patrolling the estate. "The children wake up screaming at 3 in the morning, Arthur had told her, his voice a low, gravelly threat. "They do not need coddling. They need stability. Can you provide that?" "Yes, Mr. Castiglione," Hannah had replied. Her voice was steady, devoid of the nervous tremor Arthur was accustomed to hearing from his staff. "I specialize in stability." For 2 weeks, she had delivered on that promise. The estate settled into a quiet rhythm. Hannah was a shadow, moving silently through the corridors, invisible until she was needed. When the children woke up screaming, she didn't call for Arthur. She handled it. The screams would peak, and within minutes, they would subside into a gentle hum. Arthur had watched her on the security feed. She would sit between their beds, reading softly, her presence acting as a strange, calming anchor. He felt a twinge of resentment that a stranger could soothe his children when he couldn't, but he pushed it aside. He had a war to run. The Sokolov Bratva was pushing into his territory in the ports, and the body count was rising. On a rain-slicked Tuesday night, the war came home. Arthur was awake at 2:50 a.m., sitting in his darkened study with a glass of Macallan 25 and a silenced SIG Sauer 9mm resting on the leather blotter. He had been reviewing port shipping manifests, trying to find the leak in his organization. Someone was feeding the Russians his transport schedules. At 3 a.m., the scream echoed through the mansion. It wasn't the familiar, choked cry of a night terror. Arthur knew the difference intimately. This was a shriek of waking, immediate terror. It was Lily. Arthur was out of his chair before the sound even finished echoing. He snatched the Sig Sauer from the desk, thumbing off the safety as he sprinted out of the study. The hallway was cavernous and dark. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting frantic, moving shadows across the marble floors. "Franco! Dom!" Arthur barked into the darkness, calling for the 2 armed guards stationed on the residential floor. 2. Silence. A cold spike of adrenaline pierced Arthur's chest. Franco and Dom were seasoned enforcers. They wouldn't just abandon their posts. He rounded the corner toward the children's wing and nearly tripped over a heavy, dark shape on the floor. It was Dom. His throat had been opened with surgical precision, a pool of black blood soaking into the Persian runner. Arthur didn't pause to check for a pulse. His mind went utterly cold, slipping into the hyper-focused, lethal state that had kept him alive in the underworld for a decade. He raised his weapon, sweeping the hallway, his footsteps completely silent. Another scream this time. Leo! It came from the nursery at the end of the hall. Arthur felt a primal rage ignite in his blood. If the Russians had touched his children, he wouldn't just kill them. He would burn their entire lineage to ash. He reached the heavy oak door of the nursery. It was slightly ajar. He didn't bother with stealth. If someone was in there with his kids, hesitation meant death. Arthur reared back and kicked the door with enough force to splinter the heavy wood around the lock. The door slammed open, crashing against the wall. Arthur swept the room with his pistol, his finger hovering over the trigger, expecting to find a team of heavily armed Russian hitmen. Instead, the scene before him made his blood run cold, confusing his senses so violently that he actually lowered his weapon an inch. The nursery was dimly lit by a spinning constellation nightlight, casting slow-moving stars across the walls. In the center of the plush, alphabetical rug lay a massive man dressed in tactical black. Arthur recognized him instantly, Grigory, one of Viktor Sokolov's most brutal cleanup men, a giant of a man known for breaking spines with his bare hands. Grigory was currently pinned to the floor, convulsing weakly. Straddling his chest was Hannah. The mousy, unassuming Nanny had her knees pinned firmly against Grigory's biceps, neutralizing his massive reach. Her thick-rimmed glasses were gone, shattered on the floor nearby. Her bun had come undone, dark hair spilling wildly over her shoulders. In her right hand, she gripped a sleek, black titanium stiletto blade. It was buried to the hilt in the precise junction of Grigory's carotid artery and jugular vein. Her left hand was clamped ruthlessly over the giant man's mouth, catching the hot spray of blood and muffling his desperate, gurgling attempts to scream. She was bearing down with all her weight, waiting for the life to drain out of him. It was a professional, flawlessly executed kill. But that wasn't the this that paralyzed Arthur Castiglione. It was what she was doing while she killed him. Tucked safely behind Hannah, huddled in the corner between the toy chest and the wall, were Leo and Lily. They were clutching each other, trembling, their eyes wide with shock, and as Hannah held a dying man to the floor, bleeding from a cut above her own eyebrow, she was looking back over her shoulder at the children. She wasn't looking at the man she was killing. Her gaze was locked on the twins. Her expression was incredibly soft, a stark, terrifying contrast to the horrific violence she was committing. And she was singing. Her voice was steady, melodic, and completely devoid of panic. She was humming a soft, rhythmic French lullaby, Frère Jacques, the exact same tune she used to calm them during their night terrors. Dormez-vous, dormez-vous. She sang softly, her hand pressing harder over the hitman's mouth as he gave one final, violent twitch. Sonnez le matin, sonnez le matin. Arthur stood in the doorway, his gun still raised, unable to process the dichotomy of the scene. The ruthless mob boss had witnessed unimaginable brutality in his life, but he had never seen a demon and an angel occupy the exact same space in a single breath. Grigory's eyes rolled back, his massive body going slack against the alphabet rug. Hannah held the blade in place for 3 more seconds to ensure the drop in blood pressure was fatal. Then, with a sickening squelch, she smoothly extracted the stiletto. She didn't panic. She didn't scream. She casually wiped the bloody blade on the dead man's tactical vest, folded it with a sharp click, and slipped it into the pocket of her blood-spattered cardigan. Only then did she turn to look at Arthur. The mousy, nervous energy she had displayed for 2 weeks was entirely gone. Her pale green eyes were sharp, calculating, and dangerously calm. She looked at the gun in Arthur's hand, then up to his face. "Your perimeter security is severely compromised, Mr. Castiglione," she said. Her voice wasn't the meek whisper of a nanny. It was crisp, authoritative, and laced with adrenaline. They bypassed the outer gate without triggering the proximity alarms. That means they had the rolling codes. You have a mole in your inner circle. Arthur finally found his voice. He took a slow step into the room, keeping his gun trained on her center of mass. "Step away from my children." Hannah didn't flinch. She gracefully stood up, her bloody hands held out to her sides in a placating gesture. She stepped away from the corpse and moved slowly toward the window, putting herself in Arthur's clear line of sight, away from the kids. Arthur rushed forward, sliding between Hannah and his twins. He knelt slightly, keeping his eyes and his weapon locked on the woman. "Leo, Lily, are you hurt?" "No, Papa," Leo whimpered, burying his face in Arthur's side. "Hannah protected us. The monster came in, and Hannah got him." Arthur looked at the dead mountain of a man on the floor, then back at the slight, 120-pound woman standing by the window. To take down a man like Grigori in close quarters, silently, required a level of lethal training that Arthur's top enforcers didn't possess. "Who the hell are you?" Arthur demanded, his voice low, vibrating with a dangerous mix of fury and awe. "Because you sure as hell aren't just a nanny from London." Hannah reached up, wincing slightly as she touched the bleeding gash above her eyebrow. She examined the blood on her fingertips with mild annoyance. "My name is Hannah Reed," she said calmly, "and I am a nanny. I just cater to a very specific clientele, Arthur. The agency you hired me from doesn't just provide caregivers. They provide guardians for the children of the underworld." Arthur tightened his grip on the gun. "You lied on your background check. You infiltrated my home." "I provided the necessary credentials to get the job done," Hannah countered, her chin lifting defiantly. "You wanted someone who could handle the night terrors. I handled them. You wanted stability. I provided it. And tonight, when your own men failed you, when your security was breached because you're too busy fighting a war with the Sokolovs to realize your right-hand man sold you out," she pointed a bloody finger at Grigori's body. "I kept your children breathing." Arthur's mind raced. His right-hand man? The codes. The dead comms. Dom and Franco dead in the hall. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. "Put the gun down, Arthur," Hannah said softly, her tone shifting back to the calm, soothing cadence she used with the children. "If I wanted to hurt you or your family, you would have all been dead a week ago. But right now, we have a much bigger problem." "And what's that?" Arthur growled, though he slowly lowered the barrel of the Sig Sauer toward the floor. Hannah stepped over to the window and pulled back the heavy blackout curtain just an inch. "Grigori wasn't a lone wolf. He's a breach team leader." Which means, before she could finish her sentence, the massive oak doors at the front of the estate downstairs exploded inward with a deafening crash, shaking the very foundation of the house. The heavy thud of tactical boots echoed up the grand staircase. Hannah turned back to Arthur, pulling a spare, compact 9mm from a concealed holster at the small of her back. The cardigan fell open, revealing a tactical harness worn directly over her prim white blouse. "Which means his backup is here," she finished. She looked at Arthur, the ghost of a dangerous, thrilling smile touching her lips. "Are you going to stand there pointing a gun at the help, Mr. Castiglione? Or are we going to protect these children?" The heavy thud of tactical boots, shaking the grand staircase, shattered whatever hesitation remained in Arthur Castiglione. He scooped up Lily in his left arm and Leo in his right, their small, terrified weights anchoring him to reality. "The subterranean garage," Arthur ordered, his voice a harsh whisper. "My armored Maybach S-680 guard is fueled. It can withstand armor-piercing rounds and has a self-contained oxygen supply. But the elevator requires biometric clearance." "Good," Hannah said, her green eyes scanning the dark hallway. She ejected the magazine of her compact 9mm, checked the brass, and slammed it back home with a sharp clack. "It means they have to take the stairs to follow us. Lead the way. I'll clear the fatal funnel." Arthur didn't argue. The patriarchal, commanding Mafia boss in him wanted to take point. But the father in him knew his primary objective was the two trembling bodies clutched to his chest. He sprinted down the secondary servants' corridor, a maze of narrow hallways that bypassed the main rotunda. Hannah moved behind him, no longer a shadow, but a highly trained rear guard. She moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, her weapon tracking every blind corner, every shadow. They reached the reinforced steel door leading to the private lift. Arthur pressed his thumb to the biometric scanner. The light flashed a harsh red. "Access denied. System override. Damn it." Arthur hissed, slamming his fist against the steel panel. The internal mainframe has been hijacked. The mole didn't just give them the gate codes, they locked down the house. Stairs, Hannah commanded, already pivoting toward the heavy fire door adjacent to the elevator. As she pushed the door open, a burst of suppressed automatic gunfire tore through the plaster wall directly above Arthur's head, showering him and the twins in white dust. Two Sokolov mercenaries, clad in black tactical gear and wielding Heckler and Koch MP5s, were storming up the stairwell. Hannah didn't flinch. She leaned into the doorway, exposing only a fraction of her profile, and fired twice. Pop. Pop. The sound of her 9mm was deafening in the enclosed space. The lead mercenary crumpled instantly. A clean hole punched through the ballistic visor of his helmet. The second man scrambled backward, firing wildly. Hannah stepped fully into the threshold, taking deliberate aim, and fired a third time. The second man collapsed, tumbling down the concrete stairs in a heap of tangled limbs and Kevlar. Clear, she breathed, her chest heaving slightly beneath the blood-stained cardigan. She looked back at Arthur, her expression hardened steel. Move. They descended 3 flights in agonizing, adrenaline-fueled silence, stepping over the fresh corpses of the Russian hitmen. When they reached the bottom landing, Arthur gently set the twins down behind a heavy concrete pillar. Stay right here, Arthur whispered to Leo and Lily, kissing their foreheads. Do not make a sound until Papa or Hannah comes for you. Understand? Leo nodded bravely, pulling his sister close. Arthur stepped out from behind the pillar, his Sig Sauer raised. The subterranean garage was vast, lit only by the emergency fluorescent strips. His fleet of luxury vehicles, the Maybach, a vintage Aston Martin, 3 blacked-out Escalades sat in the gloom. Standing by the driver's side of the Maybach, furiously typing into a decryption tablet plugged into the car's mainframe, was Carmine Rossi. Carmine, Arthur's consigliere, the man who had stood beside Arthur at his wedding, the man who had delivered the eulogy at Isabella's funeral just 8 months ago. Carmine, Arthur's voice echoed through the concrete cavern, lethal and cold. Carmine jumped, dropping the tablet. He spun around, pulling a revolver from his bespoke Italian suit jacket. He looked pale, terrified, but his eyes were wide with a rat-like desperation. 3 heavily armed Russian mercenaries stepped out from behind the Escalades, leveling their assault rifles at Arthur. "It's over, Arthur!" Carmine yelled, his voice cracking. "Victor Sokolov promised me the entire Brooklyn operation. The Castiglione family is a sinking ship since Isabella died. You're weak. You care more about a pair of screaming kids than the business." A cold, absolute fury settled over Arthur. He didn't feel betrayal. He only felt the icy need to eradicate the threat. "You brought the Russians into my home. You sent them to my children's room." Victor wanted collateral, Carmine sneered, edging behind the armored door of the Maybach. "Kill him. But leave the kids alive. They're my bargaining chips." Before the Russians could tighten their fingers on their triggers, the overhead emergency lights suddenly shattered in a shower of sparks and glass. Total darkness engulfed the garage. "Hannah, covering fire!" Hannah's voice rang out from the darkness to Arthur's left. Arthur dropped to one knee, firing 3 rapid shots at the muzzle flashes of the Russian rifles. In the strobe light chaos of the gunfight, he saw Hannah moving. She didn't shoot. She was a ghost in the dark, utilizing the shadows with terrifying efficiency. She vaulted over the hood of the Aston Martin, closing the distance to the mercenaries before they could track her in the gloom. Arthur heard the sickening crunch of bone, a wet gasp, and the clatter of a dropped rifle. Hannah had closed into melee range. She was using the titanium stiletto again. Within 10 seconds, the frantic gunfire ceased. The garage plunged back into a suffocating, echoing silence, punctuated only by the drip of engine oil and the ragged breathing of dying men. "Lights," Hannah called out calmly. Arthur reached into his pocket, pulling out a tactical flashlight and clicking it on. The beam cut through the cordite smoke. The 3 mercenaries were dead on the concrete. Hannah was standing over Carmine, her foot pressed firmly on the consigliere's wrist, pinning his revolver to the floor. The stiletto was pressed against his throat. Carmine was sobbing. "Arthur, please! We're family!" I panicked. "The Sokolovs," They threatened my wife. Arthur walked forward slowly, the beam of his flashlight illuminating Carmine's pathetic, tear-stained face. Arthur looked at Hannah. She held the blade steady, her pale green eyes locked on Arthur, waiting for his command. She was the executioner. He was the judge. You lost the right to use the word family when you gave them the codes to the nursery, Arthur said softly. He didn't ask Hannah to do it. He raised his Sig Sauer and put a single bullet between Carmine Rossi's eyes. Arthur didn't pause to watch the body go limp. He turned, walked back to the concrete pillar, and scooped up his twins. "Open the Maybach," he said to Hannah, his voice devoid of emotion. Hannah picked up the decryption tablet Carmine had dropped, bypassed the jam in 3 seconds, and popped the heavy armored doors. They piled in. The massive V12 engine roared to life, and Arthur slammed the vehicle into gear, smashing through the reinforced garage doors and rocketing out into the violent, rain-swept New York night. They drove for an hour in absolute silence, weaving through the storm-drenched highways, ensuring they had no tail. Arthur didn't head for any of his known safe houses. Carmine knew them all. Instead, he drove toward a property he had purchased through a blind trust 3 years ago, a sprawling, brutalist penthouse in the heart of Tribeca, registered to a shell corporation called Ethelgard Holdings. Nobody knew about it. Not even Isabella had known. In the backseat, the adrenaline crash had finally claimed the twins. They were fast asleep, curled against each other on the plush leather, exhausted by a terror they were too young to comprehend. Arthur finally pulled into the private, subterranean garage of the Tribeca high-rise. He killed the engine. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his chest heaving, as the reality of the night finally breached his hardened exterior. His empire was compromised. His most trusted friend had betrayed him. He had almost lost his children. A soft, warm hand rested on his forearm. Arthur flinched, looking over at the passenger seat. Hannah had taken off the blood-soaked gray cardigan. She was left in her white blouse, the tactical harness stark and black against the cotton. In the dim light of the dashboard, she looked exhausted. The cut above her eyebrow had stopped bleeding, but it was swollen and angry. "They are safe, Arthur," she said quietly. It was the first time she had used his first name without a title, without the professional distance. "You got them out." "You got them out," Arthur corrected, his voice rough. He let go of the steering wheel and unbuckled his seatbelt. "Let's get them upstairs." The penthouse was a fortress of glass, steel, and concrete, offering a panoramic view of the Hudson River. It was stark, minimally furnished, but secure. After laying the twins in a massive king-size bed in the guest room and locking the heavy door, Arthur walked back out to the living room. Hannah was sitting on the edge of a black leather sofa, holding a first aid kit she had found in the master bathroom. She was trying to clean the gash on her forehead with an antiseptic wipe, wincing as she dabbed at the torn skin. Without the thick, tortoiseshell glasses and the severe bun, she looked drastically different. She was striking. Her features were sharp, aristocratic, and framed by loose, dark waves of hair. "Let me," Arthur said, stepping forward. Hannah hesitated, her muscles tensing defensively, but she slowly lowered her hand. Arthur took the antiseptic wipe from her fingers. He sat beside her on the sofa, close enough to smell the rain, the cordite, and the faint, unexpected scent of vanilla on her skin. He worked with surprising gentleness, cleaning the blood from her brow. Up close, he could see a faint, faded scar running along her jawline, a testament to a violent past she kept hidden beneath a mousy facade. "The agency in London," Arthur murmured, keeping his eyes on the wound. "Aegis Defense Services? The Onyx Directive," Hannah corrected softly, her green eyes looking up at him, studying his face. "We are a ghost branch. We don't exist on paper. We are contracted strictly for the protection of high-value minors in hostile environments, war zones, cartel territories, and in your case, the highest echelons of organized crime." "Why did you play the part of a terrified, mousy nanny?" Arthur asked, applying a butterfly bandage to the cut. "Because a threat is easiest to neutralize when it doesn't know it's being hunted," Hannah replied smoothly. "If Carmine or the Russians knew you had a Tier 1 operative in the nursery, they would have sent 20 men instead of a 5-man breach team. My job was to be invisible until I needed to be lethal. Arthur finished taping the bandage. He didn't pull back immediately. His hand lingered near her face, his thumb lightly brushing against her jawline. The air in the penthouse suddenly felt incredibly thick, charged with the lingering adrenaline of survival and a new, undeniable magnetism. "You sang to them," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave. The memory of her holding a dying man to the floor while softly singing a French lullaby was branded into his psyche. "While you killed him, you sang to my children." Hannah's gaze softened, the cold operative melting away for just a fraction of a second. "I couldn't let them hear him choke on his own blood, Arthur. They have seen enough trauma. My mandate was to protect their bodies. But as a caregiver, I had to protect their minds, too." Arthur stared at her. He had spent his entire life surrounded by ruthless men and calculating women. But he had never met anyone like Hannah Reed. She was a paradox, a woman capable of horrific violence, yet fiercely, tenderly protective. For the first time since Isabella died, Arthur felt something crack in his frozen heart. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a dark, dangerous fascination. Carmine said, "Victor Sokolov wants the Brooklyn operations," Arthur said, slowly pulling his hand back, though the distance between them remained agonizingly small. "But he didn't send his top cleanup crew just to take territory. Grigori was there for a reason." "Why my children, Hannah?" Hannah looked away, her jaw tightening. She reached into the tactical harness beneath her blouse and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive. She placed it on the glass coffee table between them. "Because Victor Sokolov isn't just trying to take over your shipping ports, Arthur," Hannah said, her voice grim. "While you were interviewing me 2 weeks ago, I hacked the Russian mainframe. Sokolov is dying. Leukemia. And he has a rare blood type." Arthur's blood ran completely cold as the horrifying implication hit him. Isabella had possessed a phenomenally rare blood type, AB negative, a trait she had passed down to both of the twins. "He didn't want them as bargaining chips," Arthur whispered, the true, sickening nature of the threat paralyzing him. "No," Hannah confirmed, her green eyes meeting his with cold, shared fury. "He wanted them for parts. He wanted their bone marrow." Arthur stood up, his massive frame radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying violence. The war wasn't about territory anymore. It was a fight for his children's physical existence. "Then we don't just defend," Arthur said, his voice echoing in the empty penthouse. He looked down at Hannah, the nanny, the killer, the woman who had saved his world. "We are going to wipe the Sokolov Bratva off the face of the earth. I need to know. Are you with me, Hannah? Because this steps outside your contract." Hannah stood up slowly, meeting his gaze. She didn't look like an employee anymore. She looked like a queen standing beside a warlord. "My contract was to keep them safe," Hannah said, closing the distance between them until they were inches apart. "The best way to keep them safe is to eliminate the monster hunting them. I'm with you, Arthur. To the end." The transition from a desperate father to a ruthless general was instantaneous. Arthur Castiglione didn't just want to survive the night. He wanted to send a message so profoundly violent that no syndicate, cartel, or Bratva would ever look at his bloodline again. Hannah opened her encrypted Onyx Directive laptop, the screen illuminating her sharp features in the dark penthouse. "Victor Sokolov isn't at his Brooklyn headquarters," she stated, her fingers flying across the keys, bypassing firewalls with terrifying speed. "A man dying of leukemia, requiring constant transfusions and a sterile environment, cannot run a war from a cigar lounge. He's stationed at a private, heavily fortified medical bunker masquerading as an estate in Southampton. Real estate records show it's owned by Blackwood Medical Logistics, a private shell company." "I know the property," Arthur growled, strapping a custom Kevlar vest over his dress shirt. He checked the slide of his Sig Sauer and loaded 3 spare magazines into his tactical belt. "It's a fortress. High walls, private generators, a helipad. He'll have 20 men guarding the perimeter and another 10 inside." 30 men against 2, Hannah noted, pulling a sleek, suppressed Heckler & Koch MP7 from a hidden compartment in her duffel bag. She swapped her blood-stained blouse for a black tactical turtleneck the material clinging to her athletic frame. She looked up at Arthur, a deadly, predatory smirk playing on her lips. "I like those odds." Arthur stared at her, the dark fascination blooming into something much deeper, much more permanent. "We leave the twins locked in the safe room. The biometric seals on this penthouse are military grade. Nobody gets in." At 4:30 a.m., they bypassed the storm-battered roads entirely. Arthur chartered a private Sikorsky S-76 helicopter out of Teterboro Airport under a fake tail number, paying the pilot in untraceable bearer bonds to drop them 2 miles off the coast of Southampton. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, the perfect acoustic cover for an infiltration. They moved through the dense, coastal woods like phantoms. Hannah took the lead, her night vision optics cutting through the pitch-black tree line. She was poetry in motion, a silent, lethal ghost who communicated with sharp, precise hand signals. They reached the perimeter wall of the Blackwood estate. 2 Russian guards were patrolling the exterior, their assault rifles slung lazily over their shoulders as they huddled against the driving rain. Hannah held up a fist. "Stop!" She tapped her suppressor, then pointed at the guard on the left. Arthur nodded, drawing his Sig Sauer. 3, 2, 1. 2 muffled futs echoed simultaneously through the rain. Both guards dropped instantly, their bodies catching the wet grass without a sound. Hannah scaled the 12-foot stone wall with an agonizingly smooth grappling hook, dropping a line for Arthur. They bypassed the courtyard entirely, moving straight for the external ventilation shaft Hannah had mapped out on her satellite blueprints. "The medical wing is subterranean," Hannah whispered, her breath ghosting against Arthur's ear as they navigated the dark, narrow corridors of the basement level. "He'll be isolated. The heavy guard presence will be concentrated at the primary choke points upstairs." They encountered resistance in the lower antechamber. 4 elite Sokolov enforcers were stationed outside a heavy steel door, playing cards on a makeshift table. Arthur didn't wait for stealth. The rage of a father whose children were hunted for their marrow boiled over. He stepped out of the shadows, his weapon raised, and fired 4 times in rapid succession. 3 men fell before they could even reach for their holsters. The 4th managed to unholster his weapon, but Hannah was already there, sliding across the polished floor and sweeping his legs out from under him. Before he hit the ground, she drove the butt of her MP7 into his temple, shattering his skull. The corridor went dead silent. "Messy," Hannah murmured, stepping over the bodies, though her eyes gleamed with dark approval. "Efficient," Arthur countered, wiping a speck of blood from his cheek. Hannah wired a localized EMP charge to the electronic lock of the heavy steel door. It hissed, sparked, and popped open. They stepped into the sterile, blindingly white environment of an underground hospital suite. The air smelled of antiseptic and ozone. In the center of the room, hooked up to an array of beeping monitors, IV drips, and blood filtration machines, was Viktor Sokolov. The once fearsome head of the Russian Bratva looked frail, his skin a translucent, sickly yellow, his head completely bald. He opened his eyes as Arthur and Hannah approached, his gaze darting from Arthur's imposing, blood-spattered frame to the lethal, beautiful woman at his side. "Castiglione!" Victor rasped, his voice a wet wheeze. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. "You made it past my wolves." "Your wolves are dead, Victor," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm. He walked to the edge of the bed. "And so are you." Victor coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Business, Arthur. It was only business. My body is failing. I have billions of dollars, but I cannot buy the blood I need. Your wife, she had the exact match. When she died, I found out your children inherited it. I just needed a donation. A forced one, yes, but they would have survived." "You sent a butcher into their nursery at 3 a.m, Arthur said, stepping closer, the barrel of his gun resting lightly against Victor's frail chest. "You corrupted my closest friend. You terrorized my children. You don't get to call that business." "If you kill me?" Victor gasped, his eyes wide with sudden panic as he looked at Hannah, realizing there was no mercy in her cold green eyes either. "The Bratva will rain fire on New York. There will be war. Let them come." Hannah spoke up, her voice smooth as silk and cold as ice. She stepped up beside Arthur, her shoulder brushing against his. They will find an empty throne, a broken syndicate, and a new king who doesn't play by the old rules. The Castiglione family is no longer vulnerable. Arthur looked at Hannah. In that sterile, clinical room, surrounded by the hum of life support machines, a silent vow was forged between them. She wasn't just a bodyguard anymore. She was his equal, his partner, his queen in the shadows. Arthur turned back to Viktor Sokolov. He didn't say another word. He simply pulled the trigger. The life support monitors instantly flatlined, emitting a continuous, shrill tone that signaled the end of the Sokolov empire. Arthur lowered his weapon. The crushing weight that had sat on his chest for 8 months, the grief, the paranoia, the fear for his children finally evaporated. He turned to Hannah. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a raw, intense reality. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gripping the back of her neck, pulling her close. Hannah didn't resist. She leaned into his touch, her weapon lowering to her side. When Arthur kissed her, it wasn't a soft, romantic gesture. It was desperate, bruising, and tasted of rain and gunpowder. It was an acknowledgement of the blood they had spilled and the violent, beautiful future they had just secured. When they finally broke apart, Hannah's pale green eyes were wide, her chest heaving. "The contract is terminated, Mr. Castiglione," she whispered, a fierce, stunning smile breaking across her face. "Good," Arthur murmured, resting his forehead against hers. "Because from now on, you answer to no one but me, and we have children to get home to." The screams at 3 in the morning finally stopped. In their place, a new empire rose from the ashes of betrayal, ruled by a king who had found his equal and a queen who traded her shadows for a crown. Hannah Reed came to the Castiglione estate to soothe night terrors, but she ended up vanquishing the real monsters, securing a dark, unbreakable legacy for the family she chose.